In writing about the suffering of the cross, Father Grew, in the Manual for Interior Souls, concludes that by their resignation, their patience, and submission to the will of God, the good Christians sweeten all that is bitter in these inevitable crosses. These afflictions which the soul is made to endure, writes Jean-Pierre de Caussade, are but loving artifices of God which will one day give great joy. In this episode, we're going to take a look at how medications actually avoid or help us avoid the cross, but at the same time, it has a double-edged sword. It worsens the depression. We're going to look at the scientific evidence supporting the idea that antidepressants, antipsychotic drugs simply maintain us in a perpetual chronic condition of depression. Indeed, medications not only maintain us in a chronic state of depression, but prevent us from actually embracing that cross and deepening our understanding of our misery and of ultimately what separates us from God.
So what exactly are these psychotropic drugs doing to the neurocircuitry of the brain? Robert Whitaker, author of Anatomy of an Epidemic, describes how the SSRIs work.
So we try to assess the history of understanding of how psychiatric medications affect the brain. You see these different classes of drugs. First the antipsychotics get studied, and then actually it's the benzodiazepines, and then the antidepressants as well. And the history goes for each one goes like this. First they understand how the medications act on the brain. And one of the first was with the antipsychotics, Thorazine and Haldol. They learned that they block dopamine receptors. Then the next thing they see is how does the brain respond to it? And they begin to understand it produces an opposite response. So with antipsychotics, they block dopamine receptors, which is a brake. The brain responds by putting down the accelerator. That's the second thing you see in history. The next thing you see in history is this worry about the disorders becoming more chronic, including psychosis, schizophrenia, anxiety, depression. Over the long term, you're seeing a shift from less episodic problems to more chronic problems. And so researchers start going, what's going on? Well, the first aha moment related to the shift in outcomes, say first episode psychosis, came in the late 1970s. So the National Institute of Mental Health had run some first episode studies of first episode psychosis / schizophrenia, in which they compared drug with basically no drug, or just sort of selective use of drug. Each time there was more chronicity in the drug-treated group. You're saying, what's going on? And you hear this sort of puzzle raised by William Carpenter at the NIMH. He says, we know that once people are placed on antipsychotics, they are less vulnerable to relapse if they stay on the drugs as opposed to withdrawing them. But we raised what would happen if we never exposed them to drugs in the first place. We raised the possibility that these drugs are making people more biologically vulnerable to psychosis than they would be in the normal course of the illness. So here's this aha moment. Oh my God. These drugs that are effective over the short term, talking about the antipsychotics, may make people more psychotic over the long term. And then two researchers from McGill University, Guy Chenard and Barry Jones, say, we think we know the answer. It's antipsychotics block dopamine receptors, break. In response, the brain increases its dopamine receptors. The brain is now super sensitive to dopamine, and this can lead to psychosis and more severe psychotic symptoms. So they raised this in the 1980s. They even do this. They present on this. They even do a study, and they note and they document that at the end of 10 years, 30% of their schizophrenia patients have what's called tardive psychosis, meaning that the psychosis has deepened. Their symptoms have gotten worse, more severe. This is a horrible, horrible for psychiatry. There are stories of them presenting at conferences, this presentation, illuminating this paradox, and psychiatrists in the audience going, are you telling me that the very drugs I use to treat psychosis are making them more psychotic over the long term? And there's this sense of being flabbergasted, outraged, and what in the hell do we do if this is true? And then basically this worry is swept aside, because if psychiatry really confronts it, it's got to confront the whole psychopharmacological revolution It's not turning out the way they want it. And this is their product in the 1980s.